All right. Welcome. I'm Kate Tromble with the Data Quality Campaign, and thanks for joining us today for our webinar, Measuring Job and Credential Quality, the Role of State P20 Data Systems. Couple logistical things. Thank you everyone who is chatting their name and organization and location. Really appreciate that. It's nice to know who we're chatting with today. The second logistical piece is that we are recording this webinar. We will send it out after the fact in case you miss anything or you have colleagues who are unable to join us. In the same vein, we have 60 action-packed minutes today. We are hoping there are lots of questions to ask our panelists. And the off chance that you have a wonderful question or any question that we don't get to, we are planning to follow up after and respond to them, so have no fear. With that, let's jump in. Although a long time in the works, in recent years, there's been an intensification in efforts around the country to try and define and measure credential and job quality, and to make those efforts transparent to the public. There are a lot of aspects of this effort, and it's occurring both at the state and the federal level. The Department of Labor, for instance, has begun a Good Jobs initiative in conjunction with the Families and Workers Fund. A number of states like Minnesota and Alabama, who are joining us today, have developed comprehensive approaches to building systems and making data transparent on credentials. Other states are digging in on how they might improve their data, like expanding wage records, understanding outcomes, and demonstrating value for learners and workers. Excuse me, yet others are trying to identify credentials that meet the definition of value in their state. You get the point. There's a lot of work going on. I'm pretty sure everyone on this webinar knows about some, if not all, of these efforts. But I want to highlight that each of these efforts requires a strong, timely, secure, and accurate data system. A state longitudinal data system specifically that can measure and capture indicators of quality and make them transparent to the public. DQC, Jobs for the Future, National Skills Coalition, and Credential Engine, along with a number of other organizations, have partnered as part of the Data Champions Collaborative, which is attempting to develop a shared vision of what a modern SLDS should look like. From a workforce lens, that's particularly relevant for today's conversation around measuring jobs and credential quality. We've often seen a lack of accessible, transparent information surrounding job and credential quality for individuals, for the public, and even for policymakers. In this sense, modernizing data systems such that they provide that access in, of course, a secure and privacy protected manner to individuals, again, to the public, and also to policymakers, could really benefit, let's say, individuals who are trying to plan and navigate their own education and workforce pathways, institutions that are trying to improve their programs and align them with workforce needs, and policymakers that are trying to understand key drivers to improving economic mobility across the state. Each of these efforts requires some sort of data from different systems that is both linked and made transparent and accessible. Today, we're going to hear from three partners, Jobs for the Future, National Skills Coalition, and Credential Engine, along with two state partners, Minnesota and Alabama, about the efforts that they are undertaking to better define job and credential quality and the role that data and their state data systems are playing in that effort. So let's begin. We're going to start with an overview of the landscape with Ishwar Eswaran, who's the director at JFF, heading up the Labs Lead team. That team's mission is to find innovative and new ways to support workforce and education systems to achieve equitable economic advancement through data and data-driven solutions. Ishwar, my first question to you is about the diversity of data systems that exist across the state landscape. Can you tell us about what JFF has learned from its experience working with workforce boards attempting to measure job quality?
Hey, Kate. Hey, everyone. It's great to be here, and thanks to DQC for setting up this, this conversation, and it's pretty important that we discuss this and more. So some background here, right? So JFF, with a generous grant from google.org, has been working with, or has worked with workforce boards the past 2.5 years to see how data-driven and data-based stories can be told about the work that they do locally. And we wanted to kind of move beyond compliance-based reporting to see if there is enough data out there for us to come up with these interesting data stories of the impact of the work that they do in the communities and the learners and workers that they serve. And the objective was to kind of elevate the outcome, program outcomes, learning outcomes, job placement, and many others. Fast forward to 2.5 years now, we have learned quite a bit of under what circumstances the boards work. We kind of understand and appreciate the gaps and the constraint that they work in, and frankly, the workarounds that they put in to kind of to do what they do. And I kind of bucket them into the 3 C's, which is around capacity, around capability, and around culture of data use. And actually, a year ago, myself and the head of San Diego Workforce Partnership, Shannon Moran, we wrote a point of view piece that goes into this very subject of how organizations, specifically in the social sector and at the local level, need to make investments in order to be able to better use data for a lot of things that they want to do, chiefly around impact. What we also did was we kind of brought together our pilot group of workforce boards to kind of go into data gaps. So basically, we all knew where the gaps were, but we wanted to get it straight from the users. And we kind of instituted a data gap subgroup, which kind of went into identifying the gaps and perhaps seeing if we could come up with some workarounds or solutions for these. And we were trying to look at learner outcomes and learning outcomes, the journey a learner makes all the way from before they join into this workforce system and out, quantifying success, and so on and so forth. And the key findings of the work group is kind of being put together right now, but there is something that keep coming up over and over again. This is basically around the 3 C's, and also issues like, hey, is there is a gap or a issue of link between program completion and placement and beyond that, and are regular ways of measuring success still workable or not? Now, what we also did was we went beyond that, right? We said, okay, now we know that the workforce boards are under these kind of constraints, and this is the landscape of the data landscape of their environment. We said, okay, let's go beyond that, and we worked with Autodesk Foundation and Engineering for Change to say, what is the level of data maturity of the ecosystem itself? So we kind of reached out to CBOs, other workforce boards, HBCUs, education organizations, nonprofits supporting people records, so on and so forth. And I'll wrap this question up by saying this, right? What we keep hearing from them kind of boils down into 3 areas, right? One is, of course, the issue with quality of data. The second one is with regards to access to data itself. And the final one is the timeliness of access to data, that you're able to get access to the data in a timely manner so that you're able to factor that into your decision-making in time.
So let's take our next question and go a little deeper on that, which it sounds like what you started to hear from others, the efforts of others to advance is the tie between program and outcomes and job quality, looks at timeliness and quality of the data. Can you talk a little bit more about the most important aspects of that work for the people to understand and explore?
Sure. So, and I am, see, one of the ways in which, and this is something that all of us kind of agree on, is one of the ways in which we want to improve quality of data or the consumption of data, its discoverability, comparability, is applying standards and methodologies, right? Basically, we need to be able to follow an approach which can easily be reused and understood across the board, not just in one single place of usage. And for example, in the work with the workforce boards, we tried to adhere to that mantra. We came up with an impact of investment framework to measure impact. We came up with a data stories for impact framework so that we use a standard set of storytelling across the board for multiple workforce boards. So you're easily able to compare and contrast. We did that with the Skill Up harmonization of for the Skill Up Fund. And importantly, right, I mean, JFF recently earlier this year, acquired the Educational Quality Outcome Standard, which is our signal to the market that we take standards and program quality seriously. And again, you mentioned early on about the DOL and Families and Workers Fund focusing on defining good jobs and the task force which was created, and the mini research grant that's going on right now that some of us are involved in, that goes into defining what job quality is in different contexts of federal programs, corporate setting, and so on and so forth. And as part of that effort, what we also did was we said, okay, what are others doing in terms of looking at job quality? Because it is not just a problem that we face, right? It's truly a global problem. Everybody in the world, every agency in the world is kind of looking at how best to define program quality of job, sorry, not program quality, job quality and what a good job is. And we keep, when we go around and look, we see that the job quality post, the goalpost of job quality always keeps moving with the times, which is the nature of things. And something that we have taken into account is the job quality framework should be agile enough to be expandable and scalable. And very quickly here, some of the questions that we are reflecting upon as part of this going into the JQ framework is, what proxies can stand in for non-availability of certain data, or what other sources are available to quantify worker security and health on a job? How do we go beyond the current set of federal data, federal demographics? Or even how do you look at launchpad jobs, and how do they form how are they part of or contributing to a pathway for workers going through? So a lot of things going on right now, and it is an interesting set of conversations.
I think I have time probably for one more question before we ask folks. So if you do have questions out there, please chat them in so we can get Ishwar to answer them before we turn it over here. But just from my angle here, let's talk about the feds for a second. Department of Labor just recently, within the last 6 months, released its enterprise data strategy that ties into a growing movement to collect and use data on job quality at the federal level. What could this mean for state data systems in terms of support from DOL, and how state data systems might inform and enhance DOL's strategy?
So yes, so the DOL came up with their data strategy a few months ago. The Department of Education released theirs, I think, a couple of years ago. And I was there at the Brookings building when the secretary and Chike and others kind of talked about and released the data strategy. And among other things, right? I mean, the principles that a data strategy usually covers. I mean, there was a focus on job quality, and he put it right there in the opening of the data strategy. And besides that, of course, the strategy focuses on easy access to data, governance, and a whole bunch of other things. But from what I look at a strategy, especially when it comes from such an important player in the ecosystem, is the kind of market signaling it does, right? It kind of signals the intent, it signals the seriousness of the department and the direction in which it's going. It kind of serves as a guidance, as a guidepost to everybody else. It serves as a marker for everybody else to get behind. And importantly, it also kicks off a whole bunch of robust discussion around the topic when it's released like that. And now the DOL has a call for comments open until end of the year. So I'm hoping people are sending in their comments and feedback. Now, I want to also talk about expanding, and I did mention before about the moving goalposts around good jobs, and also how others globally are looking at it. And everybody are obviously looking at how do we go beyond the traditional measures of earnings, time spent, benefits, and others. And there are market trends that are chipping away and are kind of at the traditional measures of success. And I'm no expert here, but then I do see a lot of impact coming through automation, the remote work environment, for example, that we are in, that has a bearing on this. And I want to quickly also mention this, and this is some discussions I've had with a whole bunch of other folks, is the importance of climate and the climate crisis and climate innovation, and how the future of work and jobs answer to it, right? We are looking seriously at how we want to measure a new job that's created, whether it is really impacting positively or negatively the climate crisis. And we are trying to kind of expand the box on this. And I'm hoping at some point down the future, the question around, around is good job a green job is kind of answered, and maybe getting that pretty quickly. Those are just my thoughts right there.
So moving us from is a good job, something that's just a family sustaining wage, to something that is it a green job? Does it come with, what other benefits does it come with? What are the other things that we need to be looking at? Excellent.
Yep. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Sure. If we have any questions, the only way I'll be able to see them is you chat them. So if you've got one or two, feel free to put them in there and we'll answer them before we move on. Great. Well, Ishwar, thank you. Thank you for providing the landscape for us. It's a great background for where we're going to go with our next two conversations with our state partners who are doing this work on the ground. I appreciate your time. With that, let's turn to our first conversation between Janine Laprade, the Managing Director of Policy and Research at the National Skills Coalition, and Mary Rothschild, who's the Senior Systems Director at the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities. So I'm going to turn it over to Janine and Mary.
Great, thanks, Kate. Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you this afternoon, and we really appreciate the opportunity to share a bit more about some work that the National Skills Coalition has been doing with several states around the country, including with our partner here from Minnesota. And before, Mary, I turn to you to share more about what's happening in Minnesota. I did want to just provide a little bit of context for some of the work we've been doing with you in other states. So the National Skills Coalition currently has several policy campaigns underway, including one that is focused on ensuring an inclusive economic recovery, particularly with all of the federal investments that are coming into states right now, many of which include investments in education and training. And another campaign that is centered on making college work for all. And it's in the context of these campaigns that we've really been working with over a dozen states on how they're developing and expanding policies in two ways. One is policies that are focused on making debt-free financial aid available to working students. And this includes a priority on making high-quality short-term credential programs available to students, and also making sure that higher education and workforce data are available so that policymakers and educational institutions and the consumers of this education and training are really able to better understand what the quality of these credentials and programs look like, as well as what is equity, what are equitable access and outcomes for these programs and these credentials. So NSC has been working with states to develop quality assurance frameworks that include a set of standards and some data policies that really help them advance their capacity to both measure these credentials and related programs, as well as understand job quality potentially in the context of measuring credential quality. So with Mary here, we're excited to be able to share more about what Minnesota's been doing. We have highlighted Minnesota in 3 reports that we've released in the past few years. And I also have to acknowledge my former colleague, Rachel Vilsack, who is here with us from Credential Engine, who was a primary author on several of these reports. And the reason I think we were highlighting Minnesota in these, so the first report is one that we've just released called Data for an Inclusive Economic Recovery. And in that, we highlighted Minnesota's uniform report card, which we think does an excellent job of making more transparent the aggregate outcomes of skills training programs across the state. So that's one example that we have lifted up in some of NSC's recent publications. Another example is in a report that we released earlier this year about a mix of state innovations related to data transparency, governance, and quality. And in that, we highlighted some work that Minnesota has been doing with their state eligible training provider list to, again, really try to make sure that the data on that are available through these lists are there and transferable, that they're clearly available, and people have easy access to better understand what's happening with the programs that are available through those lists. And then finally, the third report where we've highlighted Minnesota's work is in an earlier report we did on the work that states have been doing to define and measure quality non-degree credentials. And in that, we highlighted Minnesota's graduate employment outcomes work, again, as an example of how Minnesota is one of several states that have been doing a lot to really try to put data into the hands of consumers and other stakeholders in as easy of a format as possible. So with all of that context and setup, I'm gonna turn Mary to you and invite you to just provide a little bit of a backdrop on what is happening in Minnesota, especially from a post-secondary educational attainment perspective, which from NSC's perspective is really kind of the policy context in which we're doing a lot of this data work and working with you in other states to kind of advance data policies.
Great, thanks, Janine. First of all, I want to say that I kind of represent our state team of quality credential definition and data, I call it matching in a way, and I'll explain more about how important our definition is to have match to data and data sources, as Eshwar was describing earlier. But I also want to acknowledge that the report that Janine just mentioned, the Data for an Inclusive Economic Recovery, is such an important kind of framing document for a state like Minnesota. Minnesota's work on credential attainment is rooted in a 2015 law our Minnesota legislature passed around enacting a target of 70% of Minnesota adults having attained a post-secondary certificate or degree by the year 2025. And that goal looks quite obtainable from the perspective of white Minnesotans. We are at close to that target, over 68%. But the report on an inclusive economic recovery has to do with disaggregated data. And those data would suggest that we have quite a path to still achieve some of those goals. So for example, if we look at that comparison of 68% to for white Minnesotans to American Indian and Hispanic, where both populations share only an attainment rate of 29% in the state of Minnesota. So disaggregation of data sources is critical to understanding and getting to where we want to go. And furthermore, even within certain large categories of populations, I'll take, for example, Black Minnesotans or Asian Minnesotans, country of origin can vary dramatically. So for example, Salvadoran Minnesotans have an attainment rate more in the 10% range, as do Somalis at 21%, but Liberian Minnesotans have 45%. So again, the idea of disaggregating data is so important. The other part of this work, I think, Janine, in Minnesota has to do with the convergence, as you mentioned, among many opportunities to take our data and use them for different purposes. You know, in Minnesota, we have a very mature system for our state longitudinal data system, and it's enhanced by having capabilities to look at early childhood education. I noticed some of the our attendees today are from the early childhood education world, and really provide opportunities with our early childhood education data that come from the American Community Survey. And longitudinally, right, there's no mistaking it, it's called the SLEDS program for a reason, to getting to that workforce outcome. And so again, how we use those data and how we make it transparent is critical. It's part of your report, being able to measure our impacts in that way by having the longitudinal data. The other thing I think, just as a quick background to mention, is the transparency of those data and the use. We have a variety of different methodologies, and I have to give a lot of credit, of course, to our Minnesota Office of Higher Education and their research staff for some of these sort of methods of creating public transparency. So everything from maps to resources that are linked to the data. So even in early childhood education, for example, we match resources for parents and families to those data, which I think is really quite unique. And then we also have coaching and research networks of individuals all across the state who can access our data marts that are both public and both private to the source of that information. You already mentioned the ETPL, but again, I think there are many other sources of data that through our Department of Employment and Economic Development, who's one of our partners in our quality credential work, to the Office of Higher Ed, to the Department of Education, et cetera. It's really a very robust state effort to look at credential data and again, from a longitudinal perspective.
Mary, that's really helpful. And we do have a question here that is related to what you were just speaking to. And someone's asked about the role that like the rigor or the quality of a credential program plays in like better understanding, you know, enrollment, for example. So the question kind of is, you know, what do we know about students and like what kinds of programs are they enrolling in? And could you just give folks a sense of like where you are and what you are able to kind of report on in terms of these high quality non-degree credentials? And then I know your data system is, you are working in lots of different ways to continue to develop your capacity to do that. But could you share a little bit more about like what that looks like now, where you're headed?
Yeah, it's a really good lead in to sort of our framework for our quality non-degree credential definition work. And so the framework for this is we certainly, like many other states, have a very good sense of the reason why we want to define and measure the quality credentials, right? There's really just a consensus that training, education, and our workforce system, you know, needs strong measures of the skills training for policy and for access and for measuring better outcomes. But our concept is that credentials are not to be viewed in isolation, that they are in fact tightly aligned to three different aspects: the credential, the program, which I think is what your question or what this question was about, the program itself, and the training provider, and that could be the quality of the instruction. And so our definition for quality credentials is really what we're calling a rubric. And the rubric takes into account the credential itself, the program, and the training provider. And then we're looking at it more as a point system, not as a pass or fail, right? There's a high quality definition for this credential, but there's a range of points that could be awarded for that credential. And how that definition or the points that are awarded gets used is critically important. So individuals who are just entering the workforce might be very well served by a credential that gets them on a pathway, but it might not, under other definitional aspects, have that level of high quality that you might wish to have for someone further along. But in terms of the data, you know, we have these 5 large categories of definition provided to us by NSC, so we appreciate that. But within that, we have 25 to 30 criteria, and we have measures for almost all of those 25 to 30 criteria. And many of those criteria do include aspects of curriculum, provider training capabilities, workforce needs, of course. I mean, that's going to be foundational, right? The data about worker wage outcomes and things like that. But even wage outcomes will vary by different parts of the state. So yes, we hope to have a very flexible and useful definition. And I hesitate to call it just a pure definition. It's really going to be a rubric of criteria that we can apply to the credentials in our state, and then use that rubric in many different scenarios to support our policymakers and the general public in understanding credential quality.
Great. Mary, I think that's all we have time for. This went by really quickly. Thanks for joining me in this conversation, and look forward to hearing more from Rachel and Nick. Kate.
Thank you, Janine and Mary. That's been I'm moving around. Thank you, Janine and Mary, for that great insight and some visibility on the innovative work going on in Minnesota to put together a rubric, not a definition, of job quality, as well as about the uniform report cards. I'm going to kick it now to Rachel Vilsack, the Director of State Partnerships at Credential Engine, and Nick Moore, the Director of the Governor's Office of Education and Workforce Transformation at the state of Alabama. I would love, there's a great question in the chat, which I think is open to any of our state fellows who are watching, as well as our panelists about problems with census data. So while I disappear here, if others have thoughts, I think that the folks in Arizona would love to hear what you have to say. All right, go ahead, Nick and Rachel.
Thanks so much, Kate. Glad to be with you all. At Credential Engine, we have a mission to bring transparency to the credential marketplace to improve how all types of credentials are described so that they can be searched, discovered, and compared. And the why in this work might be obvious. There are nearly 1 million unique credentialing options and close to $2 trillion spent on education and training annually in the United States. So it's important to signal clear and reliable information. This confusing marketplace of credentials causes problems. It can create and perpetuate inequities by limiting who has access to which data. So credential transparency coupled with state goals to define quality jobs and credentials, like you've heard today, leads to education and workforce system transformation so that students and workers have the information they need to make their best decisions, avoid unnecessary debt, and secure and pursue long, self-sustaining employment opportunities. And of course, so policymakers can design and implement policies that maximize the efficiency of systems to meet their economic needs. Next slide. To make data on credentials less siloed and more useful for all stakeholders, we've established a common infrastructure for organizing data about credentials. We do this by leveraging the power of technology and the strength of our strategic partnerships to create connectivity and value for anyone and everyone who's using education data to inform policy, make hiring decisions, or set strategic goals to create social and economic change. Reliable data on credentials is critical to ensuring that quality assurance definitions provide stakeholders with the necessary information to make informed decisions. And when prioritized as a part of a state's broader investment in its P20W data ecosystems, it provides stakeholders with the information necessary to make informed decisions. Better public data about all credentials is a public good that really fuels pathways and empowers everyone with information on that full range of opportunities for learning advancement and meaningful careers. As we've already heard today, next slide, state leaders are in a unique position to prioritize credential transparency and align it with their ongoing efforts to identify credentials of value within their state to meet current and future workforce needs and state education and equity goals. Credential Engine works with 28 states across the country who are working to make information on credentials, competencies, and pathways more accessible. And one of our partners in credential transparency is Alabama. Alabama has been a national leader in defining credentials of value, as well as engaging industry leaders and employers to understand the skills and competencies needed for in-demand jobs and signal that information to learners. I'm happy to turn the stage over to Nick Moore, who will tell us more about how they're working to create a modern workforce development system to bridge the state's talent shortages and skills gaps, and the role that connected data systems will play in achieving their goals.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel, and it's a pleasure to join you all today. And I've got to admit, I am the source of the delay. I will say it as a brief moment of levity that I've had some technical snafus due to having too many different meeting platforms, but not everyone because I didn't have enough. So I did not have the right account set up. But anyway, we got it worked out, and it is a pleasure to join you to share a little bit about Governor Ivey's talent development system that is based on solving problems and using data to do that, and coming up with more equitable career pathways and access to quality jobs for a lot of Alabamians who historically have just not had access to the post-secondary learning opportunities and economic opportunities needed to become self-sufficient. And so as we look at some data in Alabama, we realize that we also have to focus on adults and looking at our special populations in our combined WIOA plan to help more folks that are facing benefits cliffs enter into the workforce and overcome situations where their short-term interests and long-term interests might be at odds. And part of our strategy for doing that is, of course, our post-secondary attainment goal of adding 500,000 additional credential workers to our workforce by 2025. We started out about 43%. We're close to 46% for our target population. We've had about 215,000 Alabamians reach it, earn a post-secondary credential since the governor set the goal in 2018. And a lot of our work has been also centered on establishing a state longitudinal data system for Alabama. We use a federated model to where we're taking our workforce longitudinal database and connecting that to our education data partners. And that's allowed us to focus in, for example, on who are the individuals in the shadow labor force. So when we're thinking about the 43% of Alabamians who may be facing a benefits cliff, how do we really hone in and geofence where those individuals may be, then provide the kind of wraparound services and education training and intensive career service opportunities they need to persist and thrive in training and in the labor force. And so we are excited that we've been able to take these data and set some big goals for the state. So not just having an attainment goal for the state, but also at the regional level and for each special population, and to begin setting some goals for chipping away at our labor force participation rate. And it was important for the governor to make sure that we were doing this equitably and that we were setting our regional goals to meet the needs of the special populations in our combined plan, and then coming up with ways to intentionally go out and find community-based organizations and other partners that could help us scale the scope and reach of government. And part of what we have done is establish sector strategies in 16 industry sectors, working with the business and industry community, and had this process codified in the Alabama Committee on Credentialing and Career Pathways to put together a system that would serve as the occupational DNA or alphanumeric number for competencies and non-degree credentials, so that we could go beyond some of the more static systems like ONET and SOC codes and NAICS codes and all of these things that we're used to dealing with, and not to necessarily replace those, but at least to crosswalk them. And we've also established in-demand criteria for regional and statewide jobs that looks into factors beyond just raw demand and some additional qualitative factors. So any job that meets these criteria, first they're required, you got to have one of the other, the fourth and fifth, and if you're on 3 or more regional lists, then you get put on the statewide list. And once those jobs are put on the statewide list, we develop an occupational competency framework that we modeled off some of the work that the Urban Institute has worked on with the ETA. And we have come up with a way for making those bottom 4 tiers what some would call ready to work or workplace effectiveness, in the past been known as soft skills. And those are common for every job. Then as we go more vertically against the model, we get to more occupational specific competencies. And so we've normed these statewide, and then every year update them using establishment-based survey and the experience of our tax. And we were one of the first states to adopt NSC's definition of a non-degree credential back in 2019. And it led us to developing for example, some revisions to our eligible training provider list, our statewide list of non-degree credentials that carves out a beachhead of quality assurance and transparency that so that we could begin growing that and scaling that across all training providers in the state. And we, much like Minnesota has done, have come up with a rubric of quality assurance. We don't have as many, I believe, as 35, but we did come up with 10 characteristics of a quality non-degree credential, and credentials that don't meet all 10 of these are reviewed by our sector strategies and could then be added onto the list if they maybe meet some other qualitative factors that go beyond just the rubric. So integrating the quality assurance process into our transparency process is key. So we have partnered with Credential Engine, and they have helped us to translate and transcribe all of our non-degree credentials into our credential registry. And it's also helped us to do a gap analysis of our ETP programs and our career and technical education program, so we can begin crosswalking those time and credit-based programs into competencies. And so that's really our large strategy for hitting our attainment post-secondary education goal, is doing that through a competency-based education and skills-based hiring system. We don't think you can really have one without the other, just like the labor force participation rate won't go up without the focus on post-secondary attainment. So that's led us to developing a statewide talent development system with competencies as the unit of transaction, working with 3 main audiences of students and job seekers, employers, and education and training providers to connect talent with opportunity. And so we've worked with a company called EBSCO, which is an Alabama-based company, to put together the Alabama Talent Triad, which consists of our Credential Engine, which is also a partner of Credential Engine as a partner in helping us to manage that. And then EBSCO runs the skills-based job description generator and our learning and employment record. So the idea is that our employers are taking those occupational competency frameworks I mentioned, translating those very easily and intuitively into a skills-based job description that's then posted on our statewide Alabama Works job board. And then individuals who have learning and employment records that match up with competency statements in the job descriptions then are matched with those employers. And if they maybe are missing some competencies, it would then give some learning recommendations for them to go out and seek. And so it also helps individuals move through some transition pains that we see from moving from secondary to post-secondary experiences in and out of the workforce. So this would be a lifelong learning wallet that people are then able to maintain. We're piloting this with manufacturing, healthcare sectors, and it's going to go statewide at the beginning of 2023. So appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about this solution with you today.
Thank you, Rachel and Nick. If we have questions, I see there is some activity with folks are answering the question about an attainment rates and replacing the census data. Nick and Rachel, where are we? I guess, Nick, what's the next steps? You got the structure of what's up and the work that's come before. Where does Alabama go now?
So we've seen the acceleration of a lot of work in the past 3 years that probably would have taken a decade, because now we're getting past some of the proxies of learning that I think have kept us from realizing that it's not only just a demographic crisis that we have to look at. We also have to think about opening up and democratizing new modalities of learning to meet the needs of learners and job seekers where they are. So we are definitely going to be focusing in the next year, not only launching this talent marketplace, but also crosswalking all of our time and credit-based learning experiences into competency statements so that we can have a larger articulation index to make all learning count. And then also to help stakeholders on the supply and demand side of our talent system, that these things are not mutually exclusive. We're not tracking people into a non-degree credit system, and we're not attacking in any way traditional institutions of higher education. We're bridging these systems. And we're saying that academic, technical skills, all forms of learning matter. And it is really up to the learner to have systems that can empower them to take the off-ramp that they choose to stop at. And that indeed, if we want to have this working at its best, we could have somebody starting out with a short-term non-degree program that ends up going all the way through a PhD. And so our job is to clear a lot of the roadblocks that have been sort of artificial barriers to entry in our systems of secondary and post-secondary learning.
Thank you. One last question. As you put together your credential rubrics and your pathways, I assume you've had a decent amount of stakeholder engagement in that process. Do you mind saying just a couple of words about the different communities and stakeholders that you have engaged, and how that's enriched or been a challenge as you've developed your rubric?
Yes, and I think that's an important part. And what Governor Ivey recognized is that we needed to break down a lot of silos between not only agencies of government, and then between state government and then folks in the field that are actually training people, but also between business and industry and education training providers. And many people have had the notion of connecting education and the economy. And there's been a lot of attempts at doing that. But what we found is that we needed a common foundation for doing it. That's why we've worked on our sector strategies and our occupational ontology, because we needed an ability to take the needs of employers and translate that into a language that we could use to unbundle, modularize, stack programs, rethink how we design education and training programs. And we say sort of, tongue in cheek, that we wanted to go away from the field of dreams version of learning where build it and they will come, to a more bespoke and customized system. But also, but reinforcing that it is not mutually exclusive from existing degrees. I mean, we know, in fact, that a bachelor's degree will continue to provide the best labor market value for people over their lifetime. But it's just the different pathways of how we get folks to that point.
Thank you. But I have one last question. I'd love to have Mary and Ishwar come back with us. Maybe we can ask this last question of the three of you. So are there changes in demand of the workforce that you're seeing since the pandemic, and how's that impacting credential attainment in your state or more broadly? Why don't we can start with Nick, since you've been up, and then how about Mary and Ishwar, if you've got thoughts on it as well.
I would say that Alabama has a very robust economy, and we have recovered a lot of we saw over 1.5 million people that were directly impacted due to either structural unemployment or temporary job loss, or not being able to work as much as they'd like to. But we have seen our unemployment rate recover and our labor force participation rate recover from pre-pandemic levels. But we still recognize that we have an opportunity to allow people to move into occupations that we know that will be in demand and stable for the long term. So we focused on providing pathways in advanced manufacturing, healthcare, IT, construction, and we're now the second largest automaker in the country. So transportation, distribution, logistics. And we have found that there's been a large response to that, for example, through our Reimagine Workforce Prep grant and through the CARES Act, where we're combining short-term training with supportive services like childcare, transportation, housing. And we've trained over 7,000 people through that program. And just last point on that, we've also recognized throughout COVID and into the recovery, we've got to have a uniform state list of in-demand jobs. And it doesn't help if every agency or different institutions have different lists of what we consider to be in demand. And we need to really look at primary labor market information. And it's great to have secondary sources and online job scrapings and that kind of thing, but we've got to look at our primary LMI.
Yeah, Kate, I would say Minnesota, in a very similar way, of course, has recovered almost all of our jobs from pre-pandemic levels and have a very, very low unemployment rate. But I think there are significant implications, however, to those data points. One is related to our college and university enrollment levels, which are going down because our employment opportunities are ripe throughout our economy, which I think puts the non-credential degree work, non-degree credential work at the forefront of the future of Minnesota. And our state financial aid investigation and potential policy solutions in that area become even more important, because people will not, as long as there is a very low unemployment rate, they will not be going out of the job market to go back to college. So I wanted to say one thing quickly about pathways. Pathways are a great ideal or a theoretical model for most people, but they don't reflect the barriers that many people find themselves in by obtaining a credential and then being able to go to the next credential. There's no sort of hierarchy of them. So we know that people will come into our education system with many different kinds of credentials, the adult learner, credit for prior learning, those reducing barriers to accessing higher education, I think is what's going to be important for the state of Minnesota.
Thank you. Ishwar, we started with you, so let's let you have the last word before we close it out.
Sure, this is short and sweet. So, and I'm going to pull it beyond the pandemic, right? I mean, for us in the past 2.5 years, what we've noticed is multiple crises have had both an impact as well as kind of shine a light on some of traditional challenges that have been kind of set aside, right? I mean, the fact that when we talk to folks, they want to tell impact stories that are related to pandemic era. Once we're still in the middle of it, kind of, or at the end of it, but they're saying about racial economic equity or the economic recession then, and then I hope not, but the potential recession coming up, and that having an impact around the ever-changing nature of impact and the new stories that need to be told. And if we keep hitting on the same wall over and over again when it comes to easy access to quick data and in a timely manner, whether it's as simple as VOR data, whether it's as simple as wage data in the Pearl, or even crosswalking ETPL with Pearl, or even saying, okay, what is the support service data that we need in order to to kind of come up with success metrics on completion rates and others. We keep hitting on it, and it kind of shows these gaps over and over again. And we keep going from crisis to crisis, and we just keep doing catch up rather than having a bigger solution. So that's my closing thought for the day.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. I think this has been a rich set of conversations about both the great innovative work that's happening in some of our states and the challenges that we are seeing in terms of data gaps or lack of data, but also the real need that there is to resolve those, to close those gaps in order that we can help folks walk along a path of economic mobility. So I appreciate all of your time. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this sort of quick walk through the definitions and measurings of credential quality. As I said before, we will be following up with a recording of the webinar for anyone that was unable to join us. We'll share the slides that were shared during the webinar. If you do have any burning questions that you didn't get to ask, send me an email or one of these folks and we will make sure we answer them. In the meantime, thank you all very much and have a good afternoon. Goodbye.